All right, more George Washington. So we're looking at the phase of the war beginning to turn south. And so by the time we get into the late 1770s, the Revolutionary War stopped looking the way that it had, at the early stages. The big northern battles were beginning to fade. Those, long standoffs and the careful positioning, just kind of waiting things out. And then slowly the focus begins to shift towards the southern states. And it's not because Washington wanted it to, it's because the British did. And they believed that the South would be easier to handle. There was more loyalists in the South. There were fewer, larger cities to defend. And the plantation economies, they thought that would stay loyal to the crown. And so they changed their strategy, and that changed the war. So down south, this wasn't a war of set battles and clear delineation or lines. It was more personal. You had neighbors who were fighting against neighbors. You had families that were divided. And the violence didn't always wear uniforms. That control begins to shift constantly. And a town could be British one week, and it could be, Patriot the next. And Washington understood immediately what this meant. This was going to be the kind of war that couldn't be managed the same way. It wasn't going to be on a traditional battlefield in that sense. You couldn't just march an army and fight once and move on. You had to deal with the loyalty, the fear, the revenge, the exhaustion. And he wasn't there to control it. He had to rely on other commanders in the Southern theater. He had to rely more on militias in the South as well. And then add to that, he had to rely on the decisions made far from his direct oversight. And that made everything a great deal riskier. The victories that would happen would be uneven, and the atrocities that took place were, harder to prevent. And public support became more fragile. So the war was no longer about lines on a map. It was about whether the revolution, the cause, could survive a conflict that looked more like a civil war than a war for independence. And Washington was able to see that danger clearly. The longer the war dragged on, the harder it would be to hold the country together. And as the fighting moved south, the revolution entered its most unstable phase, because it was a war that was no longer defined by pitched battles, but by the loyalty and the fear. And then this weird, slow erosion of just certainty itself.